This is a Rogue Media Network podcast.
Do you ever have a story that you just can't get out of your head?
One that you play the details of over and over with your friends?
Well, you've come to the right place. I'm Claire.
And I'm Susan.
And this is Justice Pending,
a weekly true crime podcast where we discuss tantalizing crimes with more questions than answers.
Hey, Justice Pending listeners. I want to welcome you to a special edition of the show. Usually, I have my true crime bestie, Susan, with me discussing the ins and outs of the cases that keep us up at night. But this week, I wanted to have a special guest, Wes Ferguson, who's a journalist with his own podcast called The Unforgotten. And on season 1, The Labor Day Ghost, they look at the unsolved murder of Shelley Watkins. And it's a fascinating case and an unbelievable story. And I'm so happy to share this conversation that I had with Wes Ferguson about it with you. All right, Wes, welcome to Justice Pending.
Thanks for the invite. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, this is really exciting to me because I'm such a fan of your podcast, The Unforgotten, and season 1, The Labor Day Ghost. So I would love to just have you introduce yourself, tell listeners how you got started in podcasting and how you ended up doing a series on the unsolved murder of Shelley Watkins.
Yeah, so my name is Wes Ferguson, and I'm really more of an old print journalist guy. I came up through newspapers and wrote a couple books. I worked for Texas Highways and Texas Monthly magazines for several years, and then just got really interested in podcasts and started adding those to under my belt a few years ago. My first podcast was called Standoff, and it was about the 1974 Huntsville, Texas prison siege. And then I did one called Deviltown about an unsolved disappearance in Gilmer, Texas, which is really close to my hometown in East Texas. And it's one that happened when I was 12 and I was always curious about. And so I went back and told that story. That was Deviltown, came out in 2022. And then I guess by now it's been about a year and a half ago, I was contacted by a writer in Austin, Texas named Carol Dawson. And I had not met her, but we had a bunch of mutual friends. And some of them were, the top writers in the state of Texas. People like Stephen Harrigan, my favorite writer probably, and Sarah Bird, who is wonderful. Joe Hawley, multi-Pulitzer Prize winner from the Houston Chronicle, who's an incredible writer. And they're all friends of Carol's. And they were saying, you've written this book, a true crime book out of your hometown in Corsicana. It sounds like a podcast. You need to talk to this guy, Wes, who has already started making that transition from print writing to podcasts. So Carol reached out. We agreed to have lunch at Hyde Park Bar and Grill in Austin. And we placed our order. She starts telling me this story out of her hometown of Corsicana. And before the food hits the table, I'm like, I'm in. I'll help you any way I can to tell this story. And the story is that in 1993, a young mom from Corsicana, Texas, was found in the Trinity River by some fishermen. And she had been wrapped up in black plastic, bound with ropes and chains to these concrete blocks that had been intended to weigh her down to the bottom of the river. But then after several days, when she is decomposing, the gases had lifted this entire package back to the surface. And
that's unbelievable that it would actually result in that.
Yeah. And Shelley Watkins was a petite woman. She was very small. And so I'm sure that her killers thought that a couple of concrete blocks would be enough to keep her down, but they sure weren't. And so at this point, this case had been cold for almost 3 decades. Carol had been really obsessed with it for a long time. She had written a nonfiction manuscript about this case and also about some other crimes in Corsicana. And then, so my role was to come in and with my reporting background, I was able to help out a lot by digging into the case files, the original documents, and also I've learned to just, kind of buck up and go knock on strangers' doors and make cold calls. And so just started going through, like, made a big list of every single person who ever even touched this case at all. And one by one, calling them, emailing them, Facebook messages. And then if none of that worked, then going and knocking on the door. And so together, Carol and I, after, for her, like almost 30 years, and for me, about a year of reporting, put together a 10-episode series called The Unforgotten, The Labor Day Ghosts that came out. It started coming out in July.
It's so well done. And I have to say, when I'm listening to it, I get really excited whenever I hear people tell you no, they tell you to leave the past in the past. And I know you're not going to stop. And you say, like, they told me to leave the past in the past. And I got in my car and I went to the restaurant where I knew one of the, key eyewitnesses, potential witnesses, was hanging out. It's just so great to see you doing that old school journalism and finding the sources. And we all get nervous whenever we go talk to people who we know don't want to talk to us, but we do it anyway because that's how good stories get told.
Yeah, and we have a professional obligation to do that. And I will say, after doing this for 25 years or whatever, a lot of times you think there's no way this person will talk, but you have to give them the shot. And then sometimes they do. At least every project, there's at least one you're like, I cannot believe that person was willing to talk. And really, as journalists, it's not our decision of who gets to talk and who doesn't really, or like,
Yeah.
We have to let them make that decision for themselves. And a lot of times, we're like, these people have been through trauma, they've experienced this, it's like, hey, I'm this random guy, tell me about the worst day in your life, and you feel like a jerk. But at the same time, a lot of times people really do want to have those conversations. This is stuff that they've been carrying for, years in many cases, and they want to talk about it. And so it is a very important part of the job. And I will say, like, I haven't done a lot of projects where I've co-created something. And so that was a great way to do it. And it was also really interesting because for Carol, being from this same hometown, and also the main suspect was represented by a partner in Carol's dad's law firm, if that makes sense. And so for Carol, there's like this very personal connection to this story. And so for her, a lot of the motivation is that really deeply personal, trying to tell this story from your town, from your past. And that is often what makes these kinds of stories so engaging. And for me, I felt like I was more of the hired gun, like, for me, my motivation is like just digging and getting the story, and someone who doesn't want to talk, just, kind of picking away at that. And so that's where I get really excited in telling these stories, is getting as deep as possible.
Yes, I love the interplay between Carol, who you can tell, is so deeply entrenched in Corsicana society and history and just everything that means. And then, so she has this real emotional connection to the story and the case. And then you're just not going to stop, and you're just going to keep going. And you talk about being an outsider and how whenever you show up in these restaurants, in these bars, you're immediately made, right? They know you don't belong there. They're like, who's this outsider? What brings you to town, right? That's the line where yeah.
That's crazy to me because, I mean, I'm from East Texas. I grew up like 2.5 hours away from Corsicana, on the same highway that goes through Corsicana, goes through my hometown of Kilgore. So, I wouldn't expect to just stick out like a sore thumb, but I sure did when I, pony up to the bar and I'm asking for my Coors Light or whatever. And they just know, they're like, so what brings you to town?
That's so great.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, to a lot of people, Corsicana, Kilgore, what's the difference, right? If you're not from Texas, they might sound like basically the same place. But yeah, there's actually quite a bit of nuance there.
Yeah, and one thing I didn't realize before this project, and I wasn't super familiar with Corsicana. I have some friends that grew up there, but I didn't realize how much of a bubble that town really is. It's like people grow up there and a lot of them stay there or they
Yeah.
leave and then move back. There's not a ton of outsiders coming through. And it's a pretty old town. It was like an old money oil. It was like the first oil boom in Texas, I think, or maybe not the first, but one of the first was there. So it's like this mix of small town values, very old money, very entrenched kind of social structures. And so that can make it pretty tough when you're telling a story that involves one of these people's own, because a lot of times, like, they're more than happy to talk off the record, like gossip for 2 hours about this. But as soon as you say, well, I can't use any of that gossip, I need you to go on the record and tell me what you actually know. And then that's when it all shuts down, because it's like, well, yeah, this is what I know to be true. But if I say that, then it's gonna offend my cousin who works for the company, or like my boss, or my, preacher. And so, when everyone knows everyone, it becomes really tough for these stories to come to light, and also for justice to be served in many cases.
Yeah, I have to tell you, I had a lot of uh, flashbacks to the Jennifer Harris case whenever I was
Mm.
listening to your podcast, just because of the similarities, small town life, the idea that most people have a really strong theory about what happened in this case and a really strong suspect. And yet there's been no justice. There's been no arrest. Shelley Watkins' case is a little bit different. It got a little further down the line in the judicial process before the rug was ultimately pulled out from underneath it. But yeah, it just really made me think of season 2 of Final Days on Earth and Jennifer Harris, and I thought, wow, these two beautiful women, these two lives cut short, and so many questions and not enough answers. But what can you tell listeners about the final days of Shelley Watkins' life, those who haven't yet listened to The Unforgotten?
Yeah. So Shelley Watkins was an outsider to Corsicana. She'd grown up in Ohio and Michigan, made her way to Dallas, where she was working as a tool salesman. And she paid a call on Corsicana and ended up meeting um, Jerry Mack Watkins, whose father was the owner of Watkins Construction. And Jerry Mack was deeply involved in the company and is now he runs the company. But she meets him and they have this whirlwind courtship. From what we're told, they fall head over heels in love quickly, move in, they get married and have a couple of daughters, very young daughters. But one thing about her husband, Jerry Mack, that we were told by many people was that he was a womanizer. And, he had been married, I think he'd been married twice before. And we have on record that both of those marriages ended because of his infidelity. And we were told that Shelley had found out that he was cheating on her again. And so, but it's Labor Day, 1993, and they're out at their family lake house on Cedar Creek Reservoir, which is between Corsicana and Athens. And they're out there with family and friends, and just a very tense day. We found out a lot of this from an affidavit that was filed to get a search warrant much later. A lot of this stuff, the people deeply involved wouldn't talk to us, but we're piecing it together from that affidavit. It's not from gossip or conjecture or anything like that. But so they're out at the lake. Shelley seems nervous. She's agitated, according to her sister-in-law. And at some point, she's riding jet skis with her niece, Brandy, and they apparently run out of gas out at the lake. And they get back way late after dark. And her brother-in-law, Ronnie, is furious that, she's been out there and they delayed everything. And they're arguing. At some point, Jerry Mack takes their two daughters and just leaves Shelley at the lake, drives back to their house. And we don't know how Shelley got back from the lake to her house that night. We've been told the rumor around town was that one of the family members drove her back, but that's not really been documented that we found. But at any rate, she gets back to her house late that night and confronts Jerry Mack. And she tells him, I'm leaving you and I'm taking the girls. And he says, no, you're not. And according to a witness, he said that he took Shelley's keys and went to bed. And apparently she just walked off in a huff away from their house and was never seen again. And he claims that he just went to bed and went to sleep.
Because that's what you do in the middle of a fight. It's so easy to just roll over, close your eyes,
right.
and get some good shut eye, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so, but the neighbors had noticed that all of the lights were on. I mean, after Jerry Mack had said that he had gone to bed, he was supposedly asleep, but like all the lights in the house and all the floodlights outside the house are on, and reported by multiple neighbors that night. But at any rate, Shelley is missing. Jerry Mack essentially tells no one that she's gone. He eventually tells his best friend, who is a Corsicana police officer. There's some discrepancy on how long it takes for him to report that. At first, they said it happened. The police chief or the police officer, Louis Palis, said he told me the next day, but then later on it came out it was probably more like a couple days later. It really just depends on who he was telling at that time because the story changed.
And did he try to say that it was an official police report that he made?
Yeah.
With his friend?
Yeah. So Louis, he, number one, their house was outside of the Corsicana city limits. So it was not Louis's jurisdiction, but he kind of very quietly, a few days later, he sends out a bulletin, like a missing persons bulletin, but he doesn't inform his boss. He doesn't tell any of his other police officers, which was a violation of protocol, according to his police chief. The police chief, when he found out that Louis had kind of swept this under the rug, he was really furious. But now I'm trying to remember. So he, and then some of the neighbors are asking, where's Shelley? What's going on? And then Jerry's like, she just got mad. She stormed off, but she'll be back. And, oh, by the way, while Shelley has gone away, while Shelley is, has run off, I drove her pretty new, expensive BMW to Dallas, almost an hour away, to have the car detailed and get all the tires changed. And then he got his brother to drive the car in the total opposite direction to Bryan College Station to have the trunk replaced. And the story was
a wild thing to do at any time, much less while your wife is missing.
Yeah, it's like your wife is missing, and like, well, she was really mad because she had spilled paint in the trunk and I hadn't gotten it fixed yet, and so we're going to like have new tires and a new trunk to like greet her when she returns after she left on foot in the middle of the night. And so Jerry Mack's brother,
or wild theory, the idea that possibly it might be advantageous to get rid of any potential evidence that could be on the missing person's vehicle. I mean, wow, that's
and there would have been like the tire tread probably would have had dirt and mud from where Shelley had been tossed into the river. The trunk obviously might have had held plenty of clues, but we tracked down the manager of the service department at that car dealership, and he said he gets the job, replace all the carpet and panels in the trunk. Like, okay, whatever. Never done that before, but fine. Orders the parts. So the brother drives the car down there. The service manager pops the trunk, and it's already been stripped down to the sheet metal. So they were leaving nothing to chance. Um, yeah, and so at that point, that service guy is like, "Whoa, this is really weird." But they go ahead and do the job, and then I think a week and a day go by, and that's when Shelley floats back to the surface, and these fishermen find her, and all hell breaks loose at that point.
Yeah.
And the weird thing about that case, though, is that it was in the Trinity River, which is the county line between Navarra and Henderson County. And even though Shelley was from Navarra County, the fishermen apparently pulled her body to the Henderson County side. And so the Henderson County Sheriff's Office had jurisdiction over the case.
And see, this is another similarity with the Jennifer Harris case, because her body is thrown into the Red River. And so she's on Fannin County, Texas side when she goes missing. But then her body is found by a fisherman and is on the Red River, Oklahoma side. So then it becomes interstate issue, and could potentially be a federal case, could be Oklahoma's case, could be Texas's case. And I think all of these details really hamstring the investigations. And for a police agency, a lot of times this unsolved crime is something they just love to get off their books. And so if they can give it to somebody else to solve, we like to think that these police officers are doing this because they want to get to the truth. They want to solve every case. And there's certainly officers out there like that. But to a lot of people, it's a job. And that's a really hard day at the office, actually. And if you can pass that folder on over, sometimes that's what people try to do.
Yeah. Everybody's got a big caseload, but it also, the Watkins family were such big political players. And so, so wealthy. We were told that the Navarra County Sheriff's Office was very relieved to hand off such a sticky case to their neighbors.
Yeah. And so you have, the Watkins family with Watkins Construction, lots of deep pockets. And you have Jerry Mack's friend, who's a police officer, right? And then in the Jennifer Harris case, we have the chief suspect being her ex-husband, and his family had lived in that county for many generations, had land, had cattle, and his uncle was a detective on the Fannin County Sheriff's Department payroll, and is the one who interrogated him about him being a suspect in his ex-wife's murder.
Oh my God. Yeah. Talk about conflict of interest.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, we've talked about, a lot about some of the interesting evidence with the case, but, what are the leading theories on what happened to Shelley? What, could you put it into a couple of different columns?
So the theory put forth by supporters of her husband, Jerry Mack, was that, she stomped off in the night. Their house was within sight of Interstate 45. And so they said, well, she must have tried to hitchhike and been picked up by someone who killed her. And the reason why nobody really found that too plausible, unless you're just really focused on, trying to think of a way to make sure that it wasn't Jerry Mack. Everyone else would say, well, if she was just picked up by some passing stranger, probably would have killed her there and left her in a ditch. But instead, this person on I-45 would have had like all the materials used to wrap her up, to weigh her down, and just would have had those like in their car at their disposal. And
like
also
a serial killer kit or something, cruising the highways. Yeah.
Yeah. And also would have known all these local back roads to leave the interstate freeway and make a lot of turns in the middle of the night to get to this very out of the way highway bridge crossing the Trinity River. And by the way, this bridge is in a part of the county that's very close to where Jerry Mack and his friend, police officer Louis Palis, had grown up. So, it was in kind of their neck of the woods. But there were a lot of things complicating that, and one was that a local guy came forward and said that on the night or early the next morning after Shelley had vanished, he was driving that bridge on his way to or from work, and he saw a man outside an expensive vehicle on the bridge engaged in some unknown task. And he was shown a police lineup, and he picked Jerry Mack out of the lineup as the guy on the bridge. And Jerry Mack, he lawyered up really quickly. He, to our knowledge, has never been interviewed by law enforcement about this case, including at that time. And so it apparently took a really long time to get a warrant to search the Watkins house. And it took 2 months after her death and after she was found to get the warrant to go search the house. But when they did, they found that the floor of the garage had been painted and the driveway had been resurfaced. But they used luminol, and they found what they suspected to be blood underneath that fresh coat of paint.
Wow.
But from what we understand by that, the luminol, it detects blood, but it also dilutes, and so they weren't able to conclusively say that it was Shelley's blood. Oh, and also an autopsy had been performed on her, and they found that she had, I think, 7 or 8 lacerations on the back of her head. So she was certainly, violently struck. There's a thought about, well, did she fall and bonk her head and died accidentally? No, she was without a doubt murdered. And so, but then they do the search, they find these suspected blood, but then that's a bit inconclusive. But they feel like they have enough evidence, so a grand jury indicts Jerry Mack for the murder of his wife Shelley, and everybody's getting ready for court. It's days away, and suddenly the case is dismissed. And it was just like stunned everybody. Yeah. Like, what the hell happened? And it turns out at that time, the Henderson County District Attorney's Office was led by this guy named E-Ray, the DA, E-Ray Andrews, who was this shambling, longtime litigator who had a really severe alcohol problem, and he was a gambling addict and was also addicted to prescription pills.
Well, what a guy to be running the district attorney's office.
Right, exactly. Like, we interviewed his former assistant DA, who said that E-Ray would he drank Wild Turkey whiskey, and he would drink so much that he couldn't even come into work the next day. And so he would get his employees to come out and pick up his Jeep and drive it and park it in his parking spot, so it looked like he was at work while he was back home sleeping off a hangover. And he was already under investigation by the Texas Attorney General's office for a lot of kind of petty public public crimes. Like, he was apparently helping people get out of their DWI cases if they paid him off. He was pilfering state funds that were supposed to support his office and his employees. He was just putting those back into his pocket. And so he's like, I'm about to get kicked out of office anyway. Why not try to get some money out of this rich guy from the next county over? And so he and his friends come up with a scheme to solicit a bribe from Jerry Mack Watkins to make the case go away. And that's what they try to
Unbelievable.
do.
Actual law
Yeah.
enforcement is soliciting a bribe from an
Yeah.
accused killer to
Yeah.
destroy evidence in his
Yeah.
murder case?
Yeah. He promises to, just dismiss the indictment, to destroy evidence, to make it impossible to ever bring it back. And so E-Ray goes through a couple of middlemen to get the word back to Jerry Mack. And then Jerry Mack immediately goes and talks to his lawyer, who is this guy named Glenn Sod, who was the law partner of Carol's dad, my co-host Carol. So that's how that all ties together. And Glenn is like, you are not paying this bribe. At first they ask for $1 million, and then he comes down pretty quickly. But he's like, you're not paying the bribe. We're actually going to take this to the FBI. So the FBI gets involved and they mic up Jerry Mack, and they
Has this been made into a movie yet? Because it feels like that should have happened by now.
Yeah. Can you believe this case? I mean, it's weird. It has not had the publicity of a lot of these kinds of cases. And I don't really know why. I know that some of Shelley's family have really tried to interest all the usual players. Like, they asked Texas Monthly to write about it. Texas Monthly didn't. They've asked all the big news programs to do something, and they didn't either. And so
unsolved crimes really get short shrift in traditional media because they think the audience wants that ending and won't stick around, if it's unsolved. But enter the podcasters. Yeah.
I mean, and that's true. We get I've done now 2 podcasts about unsolved cases, and especially in both times, you hear people that are really mad. It's like, I spent 10 episodes listening to this. I put in so much time, and you're not going to solve it. I'm like, well, I mean, we told you from the get-go that it was unsolved. So
imagine how the victims' families feel. You feel disappointed that you didn't get an ending for your true crime podcast listening experience. This is their life. That's why these stories matter.
Yeah. Yeah. It's some misplaced priorities there.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you talking to me about this case. And there's so much more for listeners to hear and learn and discuss. And I hope that they will go to The Unforgotten Season 1, The Labor Day Ghost, and listen to all of your fabulous reporting. You and Carol just have my utmost respect and admiration. And I'm so glad we could connect and talk about, these cases where justice is definitely pending.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on, Claire. And definitely, we've only scratched the surface. So there's more to the story. You've got to listen to the podcast to hear the rest.
Great. Thanks so much, Wes.
Okay. Take care.
Justice Pending is recorded in Dallas, Texas for Rebel Studios. It's hosted by me, Claire Sanamaw, and Susan Passoni. Our theme music is Bending Truth, licensed at premiumbeat.com. We appreciate all listener feedback. Leave a review wherever you're listening right now, and we might read it on the air. Thanks for joining us.